Hello everyone, this is Dr. Jenkins. I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to the blood lab. There's a second video where I review blood typing, but for this first video I just wanted to give a really quick review of how to identify the different type of blood cells. Now, I know that with Dr. Mastrangelo and her online lecture you talked about this, but I think we can all agree that the more times you go over something, the better off it's going to be able to stick into our heads. Furthermore, sometimes if we hear something explained in a little bit of a different way, sometimes the way Dr. Mastrangelo says it may really make sense to you, or maybe sometimes the way that I say it may really make sense to you. But either way, you're going to have multiple opportunities. Okay? So the first part of this blood lab talks about the different types of blood cells. And you know from lecture that we have the red blood cells, which are also called erythrocytes, and they're most numerous. So all these red guys or gals are the red blood cells. And then we have the leukocytes, which is a fancy term for the white blood cells. And you'll of course be able to notice the white blood cells because they're less numerous and they're much larger. Not only are the white blood cells less numerous and larger than the red blood cells, but the white blood cells also contain nuclei or a nucleus. So for example, in this monocyte, this darker inner portion is the nucleus. And of course, our red blood cells do not contain nuclei. And that's why they almost look transparent, because there's no organelles. There is no nucleus. Lastly, we have the platelets, and they will look like really tiny little dots. Here's one, okay? Now, of course, that's not enough to know. You'll be able to, of course, identify the red blood cells easily and the platelets easily, but I want you to be able to identify, just by looking at it, the different types of white blood cells. There are 5 types of white blood cells: neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. You're going to talk about this with Dr. Mastrangelo in lecture, but the lab, of course, is more hands-on. So in the lab, here, we're going to focus on what they look like. For your first lab quiz, you're going to be asked to identify them. You'll see a picture, and you're going to have to know which of the 5 types of white blood cells it is. Okay? Let me just look ahead. Okay. Maybe Dr. Mastrangelo talked about this, but in terms of the white blood cells, we have the most neutrophils, and so this is a little saying to help us remember which white blood cells we should have a lot of. Neutrophils will have the second most amount of lymphocytes, the third most amount of monocytes. We'll have not very many eosinophils, and we'll have the very least, very, very few, under normal healthy circumstances, basophils. So one way to remember that is never let monkeys eat bananas. See? Good stuff, right? All right, here's how I look at the different types of white blood cells. The neutrophil is going to be the most common, and the neutrophil has a segmented, it's not going to fit, there we go. The neutrophil has a segmented nucleus. So it's technically one nucleus, and it might be connected by a really thin strand, but it'll have different segments. So it's one nucleus, but it always has to be connected. You can see in this picture, it's barely that little strand connecting it. So you will see a lot of these, and they'll come in all sorts of nucleus shapes. Okay, but kind of run through this like process of elimination. If you think it's a neutrophil, then, but you're not quite sure, then you'll go through the others, and as long as it doesn't fit any of the others, then it's a neutrophil. Segmented nucleus. An eosinophil is going to have 2 big lobes in their nucleus. So it's one nucleus that has two big lobes. One of my colleagues thinks it looked like earmuffs, but I just can't help it. To me, they look like boobs because we got two large ovals next to each other. Eosinophil. Okay, the basophil is going to have many tiny nuclei. And sometimes there'll be so many of them packed together that it might look like one solid nucleus. In fact, this picture here kind of looks like one big nucleus. But if you look carefully, it almost looks stippled. This one is not such a good picture up top, so I probably wouldn't use that on an exam, but this bottom one I would use. If you look closely, it looks stippled. Many, many, many small nuclei. And of course, that's the least common because never let monkeys eat bananas, B for basophil. Now, on the other hand, the lymphocyte, they're pretty common. It's the second most common. A lymphocyte has one large nucleus. And that nucleus pretty much takes up the whole cell. So in this picture, this whole thing is a nucleus. Takes up almost the whole cell. Probably the most difficult one, I think, in my experience, to identify would be the monocyte. Some resources, some textbooks or websites will say that the nucleus is kidney-shaped. And I suppose this picture kind of looks kidney-shaped because it kind of looks like that. This is not a good picture up top. So some say it's kidney-shaped. Some other sources will say it's horseshoe-shaped, so it might look more like this, the nucleus that is. But again, it's process of elimination. So at least in the lab exams here, I'm only going to be asking you one of each. So if you do process of elimination, if it's not one big nucleus, but it kind of has a little kidney shape to it, then you know it's going to be a monocyte. These are the tips that work for me. Maybe as I'm going through this, or Dr. Mastrangelo goes through it, maybe something else comes to your head. You use whatever works for you. All right. In the lab assignment, you're going to be asked to do a quote-unquote blood cell count, and it's going to be asking you to compare to a normal blood cell count. So here's that information that you'll compare it to. And then the rest of this lab talks about the blood typing, which I have a second video for. So good luck. Let's start the semester off on the right foot, and I am here if you have any questions.